The moment Emma Chin walked through those towering mahogany doors, she knew something was desperately wrong. 3 identical faces stared down at her from the top of the grand staircase, 6-year-old boys, with haunted eyes and clenched fists. Behind them, their father stood motionless, watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. And in that split second, when the smallest triplet whispered a name she hadn't heard in 7 years, Emma realized this wasn't just another housekeeping job. This was the reckoning she'd been running from since the night everything fell apart. But how could a child she'd never met know the one word that connected her to the darkest chapter of this family's history? 2 weeks earlier, Emma had been standing in a different kind of doorway, the cramped entrance to her studio apartment in Queens, staring at the eviction notice taped to her door. Her daughter Lily, just turned 5, was asleep on the pull-out couch they shared, completely unaware that they had 14 days to come up with 3 months' back rent or lose the only home she'd ever known. Emma pressed her palm against the notice, feeling the cheap paper crinkle under her fingers, and did the math she'd been doing every night for the past 6 months. Even with double shifts at the diner and weekend cleaning jobs, the numbers never added up. Her ex-husband's child support checks had stopped coming the same month he'd remarried, and her mother's medical bills from the cancer treatment had drained every penny of Emma's savings. She was 32 years old, working herself to exhaustion, and still drowning. That night, scrolling through job listings while Lily's soft breathing filled their tiny room, Emma found the posting that would change everything. Live-in housekeeper needed for private household. Immediate start. Competitive salary plus room and board for employee and 1 child. Discretion required. The salary listed was more than she made in 3 months at the diner. She'd sent her application before she could talk herself out of it, knowing that positions like this usually went to people with references she didn't have and credentials she couldn't afford. But desperation had a way of making you brave, or maybe just reckless. What she didn't know was that the household had gone through 17 housekeepers in the past 8 months, and that every single one had quit within days, some within hours, all citing the same reason: the children. The response came faster than she'd expected. A woman named Patricia called the next morning, her voice crisp and professional, with an undertone Emma couldn't quite place. Exhaustion, maybe. Or warning. The position is challenging, Patricia had said. Mr. Donovan is a busy man. He's rarely home. The children are spirited. They've had difficulty adjusting since their mother passed. Emma had gripped her phone tighter, watching Lily eat cereal at their cramped table, milk dribbling down her chin. I can handle spirited, she'd replied, and Patricia had made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sigh. Can you start Monday? The previous housekeeper left this morning. Didn't even stay for a final check. Emma had said yes before Patricia finished the sentence. Adrian Donovan's estate sat in the hills of Connecticut, like a monument to wealth Emma couldn't fathom. The car service Patricia had arranged picked them up at dawn, and Lily had pressed her face against the window the entire 2-hour drive, watching the city give way to suburbs, then to sprawling properties hidden behind gates and walls. "Mama, are we going to live in a castle?" she'd whispered, and Emma had pulled her close, breathing in the strawberry scent of her daughter's shampoo. "Something like that, baby." But as the iron gates swung open and the mansion came into view, 3 stories of stone and glass rising from perfectly manicured grounds, Emma felt something cold settle in her stomach. This wasn't a castle. This was a fortress. And the question wasn't whether she could handle the job. The question was what kind of children needed 17 housekeepers in 8 months. Patricia met them at the service entrance, a woman in her mid-50s, with gray-streaked hair pulled into a tight bun and eyes that had seen too much. She gave Emma's worn suitcase and Lily's backpack a quick glance before leading them through a maze of hallways. "The children are in their wing," Patricia said, her heels clicking against marble floors. Aiden, Benjamin, and Christopher. Triplets, all identical. 6 years old. They lost their mother 2 years ago in a car accident. Since then, Mr. Donovan has tried to maintain stability, but... She paused at the base of a staircase that curved up into shadows. They test people, push boundaries. Most housekeepers don't make it past the first tantrum. Emma felt Lily's hand tighten in hers. "What kind of tantrums?" she asked quietly. Patricia's expression flickered with something that looked like sympathy, the kind that feel designed to break you. The staff quarters were more spacious than their entire queen's apartment, 2 rooms with an adjoining bathroom, furniture that didn't wobble, windows that overlooked gardens Emma had only seen in magazines. Lily had immediately claimed the smaller bedroom, spinning in circles on the carpet. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even though Patricia had left them alone to settle in. She unpacked their few belongings, tucking Lily's stuffed rabbit on the pillow, hanging their clothes in a closet that could have fit 3 times what they owned. On the nightstand in her room, someone had left a folder with her employment contract and a schedule. The contract was standard except for one clause that made her pause. Employee agrees to maintain strict confidentiality regarding all household matters, including but not limited to family dynamics, personal information, and any incidents involving the minor children. She'd signed enough NDAs in her years of cleaning wealthy people's homes to recognize a warning when she saw one. That first evening, Patricia had given them a tour of the main house, pointing out which rooms were off-limits: Mr. Donovan's private office, the master suite, and a locked door on the 2nd floor that Patricia referred to simply as the memorial room. Emma hadn't asked what that meant. She'd learned early in this line of work that wealthy people's grief took forms the rest of the world couldn't afford. What struck her most was how quiet everything was. No television sounds, no music, no laughter. Just the tick of antique clocks and the whisper of central air through vents. "The children eat at 6, Patricia said as they passed a dining room with a table that could seat 20. "Mr. Donovan usually works late. You'll be responsible for their meals, homework, bedtime routine. They have a tutor who comes 3 times a week. Swimming lessons on Thursdays. No screen time after 7. It sounded manageable. Almost too manageable. Emma should have known better. She met the triplets the next morning, and that's when she understood why 17 housekeepers had failed. They were beautiful children, dark curls, sharp green eyes, delicate features that would probably break hearts one day. But there was something in the way they looked at her, all 3 of them standing in a perfect line in the playroom, that felt more like an assessment than a greeting. Patricia had made introductions. Aiden, the oldest by 3 minutes, stood in the middle. Benjamin on the left, Christopher on the right. They didn't speak, didn't smile, just stared at Emma with an intensity that made her want to step backward. "Boys, this is Emma. She's going to be taking care of you." Patricia's voice had an edge of tension. "Please make her feel welcome." The silence stretched for a long moment. Then Aiden tilted his head slightly and said, "How long do you think this one will last?" The testing started immediately. During breakfast, Benjamin accidentally knocked over his orange juice, letting it flood across the table toward Emma's lap. She'd caught it with a napkin before it could spill, her waitress reflexes still sharp. "Gravity's tricky," she'd said mildly, mopping up the mess. "Happens to everyone." Christopher had hidden her car keys in the garden, watching from a window as she'd searched. She'd found them 20 minutes later, tucked inside a flower pot, and hadn't mentioned it. Just pocketed them and continued with the day. Aiden had tested her differently, asking questions designed to trip her up, contradicting himself, seeing if she'd get frustrated or confused. She'd answered calmly, never taking the bait. By the end of that first day, she was exhausted, but she hadn't quit, and she could see in their faces that this confused them. The breakthrough came on the 3rd day, in a way Emma hadn't expected. She'd been making lunch when she heard crying from upstairs, real crying, not the manufactured tantrums she'd witnessed over the past 48 hours. She'd taken the stairs 2 at a time and found Christopher sitting in the hallway outside the locked memorial room, tears streaming down his face. The other 2 boys stood nearby, looking uncertain. "She used to sing to us," Christopher had choked out when Emma knelt beside him. "Every night. I can't remember her voice anymore." Emma's own grief had risen in her throat. She knew that particular pain, the terror of forgetting. "What did she sing?" she'd asked gently. Christopher had whispered, "You are my sunshine." And Emma, without thinking, without calculating, had started singing it. Softly at first, then stronger. The boys had gone completely still. When she finished, Aiden had said quietly, "You sound like her. A little bit." That night, after the boys were in bed, Emma had sat in the staff kitchen with Patricia over tea, finally asking the questions she'd been holding back. Their mother, what happened exactly? Patricia had wrapped both hands around her mug, steam rising between them. Elena. She was special, kind, patient, everything those boys needed. She and Adrian had only been married 2 years when the accident happened. She was driving home from a charity event, late at night. A truck ran a red light. She died instantly. Patricia's voice had cracked slightly. Adrian, he couldn't function for months. The boys were only 4. They became wild with grief, and he couldn't reach them. He threw himself into work instead. 14-hour days, business trips, anything to avoid being home, avoid facing what they'd lost. Emma had understood then. The boys weren't trying to break the housekeepers. They were trying to push them away before they could leave on their own, before they could become another loss in a series of losses. The pattern of the household became clear over the following days. Adrian Donovan was a ghost in his own home. Emma caught glimpses of him, a tall figure disappearing into his office at dawn, the sound of his car leaving before the boys woke up, his return long after they'd gone to sleep. The few times they passed in hallways, he'd given her curt nods, his face unreadable. He looked like a man running from something, which Emma supposed he was. Grief had a way of chasing you, especially when you refused to turn around and face it. The boys had responded by creating chaos wherever possible, probably hoping that if things got bad enough, their father would have to pay attention. But he never did. He just hired another housekeeper and added another lock to his office door. Emma established her own rhythm with the children, different from what they'd expected. She didn't try to replace their mother or pretend their pain didn't exist. She acknowledged it, gave it space. When Aiden threw his dinner plate against the wall in a rage, she cleaned it up without yelling, then sat beside him and said, "You're allowed to be angry, but you still have to help me clean the kitchen afterward." When Benjamin had nightmares, she sat outside his door until he fell back asleep, not hovering but present. When Christopher missed his mother during homework, she let him cry, handed him tissues, and waited until he was ready to continue. Slowly, incrementally, their walls started coming down, not because she was breaking through their defenses, but because she wasn't treating their defenses as something wrong. She was treating them as human. Lily had been the unexpected bridge. The boys had been fascinated by her from the start, a little girl, unafraid of them, unimpressed by their tricks. She'd walked into their playroom on the 4th day and announced, "I like your trucks, but they're all parked wrong. Want me to show you how my mama's friend Tony parks delivery trucks?" And she'd proceeded to organize their entire toy collection while they watched in amazement. Within a week, they were protective of her in a way that surprised Emma. When Lily had scraped her knee in the garden, all 3 boys had run to get bandages, arguing over who should carry the antiseptic. It was the first time Emma had seen them work together instead of competing. The first time she'd seen them care about someone outside their private circle of grief. But something else was happening, something Emma couldn't quite name. She'd started noticing things around the house that felt wrong. Not dangerous, but off. Photographs in the hallway that had been rearranged. A book in the library left open to a specific page about memory and childhood trauma. Her own room, which she was certain she'd locked, showing signs of someone having been inside. Nothing taken, just searched. And the boys' reactions to certain things she did. The way she organized the playroom, the specific snacks she made, how she folded their blankets. Sometimes they'd exchange glances that felt like recognition, like she was doing something they remembered, even though they'd never met her before this week. It was Aiden who finally said something. 2 weeks into Emma's employment, he'd been helping her sort laundry in the utility room when he'd picked up one of Christopher's shirts and started folding it a specific way. Corners tucked in, then rolled instead of folded flat. "That's wrong," Emma had said automatically, taking the shirt and refolding it properly. Aiden had stared at her. "That's how Mama did it." Emma's hands had frozen. "What?" His green eyes were too knowing for a 6-year-old. "You fold exactly like she did. The laundry, the blankets, even how you arrange our plates at dinner. Triangle formation with the vegetables, protein at the top." Emma's heart had started racing. That's just efficient. Lots of people probably. But Aiden had interrupted, his voice dropping to a whisper. And you sing her song the same way. The words where she would slow down. You slowed down in the same places. That night, Emma had done something she told herself she wouldn't do. She'd gone to the library after everyone was asleep and searched for information about Elena Donovan. The internet held scattered pieces, society page photos from charity galas, a brief obituary, a few articles about the accident. Elena had been 28 when she died, delicate and dark-haired in the pictures. She'd been involved in children's literacy programs, volunteer work at hospitals, fundraising for cancer research. There was one photo that had made Emma's breath catch. Elena standing outside a small clinic in Queens, cutting a ribbon at its opening. The date was 7 years ago. Emma had stared at that photo for a long time, a memory tugging at the edges of her consciousness. A young woman in a waiting room, holding her hand when the diagnosis came. A stranger who'd stayed even though visiting hours were over. A woman who'd promised, "You're not alone in this." The next morning, Emma had walked into the kitchen to find Adrian Donovan sitting at the breakfast table. It was the first time she'd seen him present during daylight hours on a weekday. He looked exhausted, his expensive suit rumpled, dark circles under eyes that were the same sharp green as his son's. "We need to talk," he'd said without preamble. Emma had felt her pulse spike. This was it. Somehow he'd figured out that she wasn't just a random housekeeper, that there was a connection she'd been trying to understand herself. But instead, Adrian had said, "The boys are responding to you. Patricia tells me they've been calmer, cooperative. I want to know what you're doing differently." Emma had poured herself coffee to buy time, choosing her words carefully. "I'm not doing anything special. I'm just consistent, present. I don't try to fix their grief. Just give them space to feel it." Adrian's jaw had tightened. Their grief is being managed by professionals, therapists, specialists. What they need is structure, routine, discipline. And Emma, who usually knew better than to contradict wealthy employers, had heard herself say, what they need is their father. The temperature in the room had dropped 10 degrees. Adrian had stood, his frame imposing even in exhaustion. "You've been here 2 weeks. Don't presume to understand things that are none of your concern." He'd walked out before Emma could respond, leaving her standing in the kitchen with her heart pounding and the certain knowledge that she'd just crossed a line. But she couldn't regret it, because it was true. The boys needed their father to stop running. They needed him to sit with them in their pain, instead of hiring people to manage it from a distance. And some part of Emma understood that she'd been hired not to help the children heal, but to help Adrian avoid having to do that work himself. Things shifted after that confrontation. Adrian started coming home earlier, appearing in doorways to watch Emma interact with the boys, his expression unreadable. She'd feel his gaze on her while she helped Benjamin with reading, while she played trucks with Christopher, while she let Aiden ask his endless questions about why things worked the way they did. She couldn't tell if he was looking for mistakes or trying to understand what she was doing that 17 other housekeepers hadn't. The boys noticed his presence too. They'd glance at their father with a mix of hope and wariness, like animals who'd been hurt learning to trust again. He never joined them, just watched from the periphery, a ghost haunting his own life. It was Patricia who'd pulled Emma aside one afternoon, her expression troubled. "Be careful," she'd said quietly. They'd been in the gardens, watching Lily and the boys play tag among the hedges. "Careful of what?" Emma had asked. Patricia had chosen her words with precision. "Adrian's been through therapists, housekeepers, nannies, people who try to fix things, people who judge him for how he's handling his grief. You're the first person who's made progress with the boys without pushing him. But that also makes you dangerous." Emma had frowned. "I'm not trying to be dangerous. I'm just trying to take care of the kids." Patricia's gaze had been knowing. "That's exactly what makes you dangerous, because you remind him of what he lost, of what his children need, that he can't give them. And men like Adrian don't respond well to reminders of their failures." The boys had started telling Emma stories about their mother. Small things at first, how she'd make funny voices when reading bedtime stories, how she'd let them bake cookies even though they'd make a mess, How she'd tuck them in with the specific ritual involving 3 kisses and a promise that she'd be there in the morning. Except one night she wasn't, Benjamin had said matter-of-factly. They'd been doing puzzles in the playroom, rain drumming against the windows. She went to the party and never came home. Daddy said she was in heaven. But if heaven is so good, why didn't she want to stay with us instead? Emma hadn't had an answer for that. There was no answer that would make sense to a 6-year-old's understanding of loss. So she just held him, letting him cry against her shoulder, and wondered what kind of woman Elena Donovan had been to leave such an enormous hole in her children's lives. That night, Emma had dreamed about the clinic in Queens, about sitting in that sterile waiting room, the smell of antiseptic and fear, the doctor's words that had shattered her world into before and after. The cancer is aggressive. We need to start treatment immediately. She'd been 25, alone, terrified. And then the woman had sat beside her, dark-haired, gentle-voiced, with eyes that held genuine compassion. "I volunteer here," she'd said. "I know this is overwhelming. Can I sit with you?" They talked for hours that night, about fear and hope, and the weird limbo of waiting for test results. The woman had come back the next day, and the day after that, bringing magazines and snacks, just sitting with Emma through the worst of it. She'd never said her name, had just squeezed Emma's hand before leaving one day and said, "You're stronger than you know. Don't forget that." Emma had tried to find her later, to thank her, but the volunteer coordinator had no record of anyone matching her description working at the clinic during that time. She'd woken from the dream with tears on her face and a certainty building in her chest. The next morning, while the boys were with their tutor, Emma had gone back to the library and dug deeper into Elena Donovan's life. The cancer research fundraising wasn't random. Elena's mother had died of cancer when Elena was in college. She'd spent years after that volunteering at treatment centers, support groups, anywhere she could help people facing what her mother had faced. And there, buried in an old social media post from 7 years ago, Emma had found a photo. Elena, younger, standing with a group of volunteers outside the Queen's clinic. Emma's hands had shaken as she zoomed in on the faces. It was her, the woman who'd sat with her through the darkest period of her life, the woman who'd told her she wasn't alone. Elena Donovan had been the stranger who'd shown Emma kindness when she'd needed it most. And now Emma was taking care of her children. The realization had shifted everything in Emma's mind. This wasn't coincidence. It couldn't be. But what did it mean? Had Elena told Adrian about the people she'd helped? Had Emma's name been in some database, some file? And if so, why had Adrian hired her specifically? Or had it truly been random? The universe's way of bringing things full circle, putting Emma in a position to repay a debt she'd never had the chance to acknowledge? She'd sat in the library for a long time, holding that truth, trying to understand what she was supposed to do with it. The employment contract's confidentiality clause had taken on new meaning. Don't talk about family matters. Don't share personal information. Like maybe Adrian knew exactly who Emma was and had hired her intentionally. Or maybe he had no idea, and learning the truth would shatter whatever fragile progress had been made. Emma had decided to say nothing, to keep working, keep caring for the boys, and see where the truth revealed itself. But secrets had weight, and this one pressed on her every time she looked at Aiden's green eyes, or heard Christopher's laugh, or helped Benjamin with homework. These were Elena's children, the woman who'd saved Emma's life, not physically, but emotionally. In those dark weeks, when giving up had seemed easier than fighting, had left behind 3 boys who needed exactly what their mother had given Emma. Consistent, judgment-free presence. Someone who showed up and stayed. Emma could do that. She could be that for them, even if they never knew why it mattered so much. But the house itself seemed to have secrets it wanted revealed. Emma had been putting the boys to bed one night when Christopher had asked if she could get his favorite stuffed animal from the playroom. She'd gone to retrieve it and found the door to the memorial room, the locked room she'd been told never to enter, standing slightly ajar. Light spilled from inside, warm and golden. Emma had known she should walk away, respect the boundary, but something pulled her forward. She'd pushed the door open fully and stepped inside. The room was a shrine to Elena. Photographs covered every wall. Elena pregnant, Elena holding newborn triplets, Elena laughing with the boys in the garden, Elena and Adrian on their wedding day. Furniture from what must have been her favorite spaces, a reading chair, a writing desk, shelves of books, and in the corner, a music box sat open, still playing a tinkling melody. "You Are My Sunshine." She used to play that every night. Adrian's voice behind her had made Emma jump. He'd been standing in the doorway, still in his work clothes, looking hollowed out. Before bed. It was part of their routine. Emma had turned slowly. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to intrude." The door was... But Adrian had held up a hand. "I left it open. I come here sometimes when I can't sleep, when the silence in the rest of the house gets too loud." He'd walked past her, running his fingers along the edge of Elena's desk. "Do you know what the worst part is? I can't remember her voice anymore either. I try, but it's fading. And I'm terrified that one day I'll forget completely. That my sons will grow up with photographs instead of memories." Emma had stayed very still, letting him talk. This was the first time Adrian had shown any vulnerability, any crack in the fortress he'd built around his grief. "The other housekeepers," he'd continued, still not looking at her. "They either pitied the boys or tried to fix them, turn them into neat, manageable children who wouldn't remind me every day of what I'd lost. But you," he'd finally met her eyes, "you let them be broken. You don't try to glue the pieces back together in some new shape. You just sit with them in the brokenness." Why? Emma had chosen her words carefully. Because grief isn't something to fix. It's something to survive. And you can't survive it alone. Adrian had studied her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. "Who did you lose?" The question had caught Emma off guard. She'd started to deflect, to keep the wall up between employee and employer. But something about standing in that room full of Elena's memory had made the truth feel necessary. "I almost lost myself," she'd said quietly. 7 years ago. I got sick. Cancer. I was alone, terrified, certain I was going to die. And a stranger sat with me through it. A volunteer at the clinic. She came every day, brought me books, held my hand during the worst of the treatment. She told me I was strong enough to survive. And she was right. I did survive. But I never got to thank her. She disappeared before I was cleared, and I could never find her again." Emma had watched Adrian's face carefully. "She saved my life, and I never even knew her name." Adrian had gone very still. "What clinic?" His voice had been barely a whisper. Emma had told him. Watched the color drain from his face as the pieces connected. "Elena," he'd breathed. "She volunteered there. She never told me names, just stories. People she'd helped. She'd come home and tell me about the young woman fighting cancer who reminded her of her mother. She said," his voice had broken, "she said she hoped someone would sit with our boys if they ever needed it the way this woman needed it." The air in the room had felt electric, charged with the weight of impossible coincidence. "You're her," Adrian had said, and it wasn't a question. "You're the woman Elena told me about. The one she couldn't stop thinking about. She tried to find you later, to check on you, but patient privacy laws wouldn't let her access records." Emma had nodded, tears streaming down her face now. "I didn't know it was her until I saw the photos. I didn't know who she was, who she'd become. But the moment I heard the boys singing that song, something in me recognized it. Your wife gave me the will to fight when I'd given up. And now I'm here, taking care of her children. How is that possible?" Adrian had sunk into Elena's reading chair, his face in his hands. She used to say that kindness creates debts the universe always repays. That if you help people without expecting anything back, the world finds a way to balance the scales. I thought it was just optimism, the way she saw things. But this. He'd looked up at Emma with an expression of wonder and anguish. "This is her. This is Elena keeping her promises, even from beyond death. Making sure her boys had someone who understood what they were going through, because you've been through your own darkness." They'd stayed in that room for hours, talking. Adrian told Emma things he'd never said to the therapists or housekeepers, or even his business partners. How he blamed himself for Elena's death, because he'd asked her to attend the charity gala alone while he stayed home, with a work crisis. How he'd pushed the boys away, because seeing them was like looking at mirrors of Elena. They had her eyes, her smile, her way of tilting their heads when they were thinking. How he'd hired housekeeper after housekeeper, hoping one would be good enough, that he wouldn't have to face his own failure as a father. "They don't need another employee," he'd said finally. "They need me. But I don't know how to be what they need anymore. I don't know how to be the father Elena expected me to be." Emma had knelt in front of his chair, making him meet her eyes. "You start by showing up. Not perfectly, not with all the answers, but just present. You sit with them at breakfast. You ask about their day. You tuck them in at night even if it breaks your heart, because it reminds you of her. You show them that even though you're broken too, you're not abandoning them." Her voice had been fierce. "Elena gave me the will to fight for my life. The least I can do is help her children fight for theirs. But they can't do that without their father. I can feed them, help with homework, sing them to sleep. But I can't be you. And they need you." The next morning had brought a seismic shift in the household. Adrian had appeared at breakfast, awkward and uncertain, taking the seat at the head of the table that had sat empty for 2 years. The boys had stared at him with wide eyes, forks frozen halfway to their mouths. "Good morning," he'd said, his voice rough. I thought maybe we could eat together today, if that's okay." Aiden had exchanged glances with his brothers, that silent triplet communication Emma had learned to recognize. "Okay," he'd said cautiously. And they'd sat there, the four of them, navigating the strange territory of being a family again. It had been painful to watch, Adrian asking stilted questions, the boys giving careful answers, everyone dancing around the enormous grief that filled the room like smoke. But it was a start, and that, Emma knew, was everything. But starts, she was about to learn, could be dangerous when powerful people had interests in maintaining the status quo. It started with small things Emma almost didn't notice. Files in Adrian's office being accessed when he was away. Phone calls that ended abruptly when she entered rooms. Patricia pulling her aside with worried warnings about people asking questions about Emma's background. Then came the anonymous email to Adrian's business account, forwarded to Emma by his assistant with a note that said, "Mr. Donovan thought you should see this." The email contained photographs of Emma from 7 years ago, gaunt from chemotherapy, leaving the Queen's clinic, her face drawn with illness. The message read, "Your new housekeeper isn't who she claims to be. She targeted your family deliberately. Check her employment application. She lied about her medical history. Liability risk. Security risk. Get rid of her before she causes real damage." Emma had stared at the email with rising dread, recognizing the threat for what it was. Someone didn't want her there. Someone had researched her past, weaponized her illness, tried to frame her presence in the Donovan household as predatory rather than providential. But who? And why? The answer came 2 days later when Adrian's business partner, Gerald Reeves, arrived unannounced at the estate. Emma had been in the garden with the children when Patricia came out, her face tight with concern. "Mr. Reeves is in Adrian's office. He's asking to speak with you." Emma's stomach had dropped. She'd met Gerald briefly once, a slick man in his 50s with calculating eyes and a smile that never reached them. Adrian had mentioned he'd been pressuring him to sell the company, to take advantage of acquisition offers now that Elena wasn't there to anchor Adrian to his original vision. The meeting had been a trap disguised as concern. Gerald had sat behind Adrian's desk, a power play Emma recognized immediately, and gestured to the chair across from him like she was being interviewed. "Emma, is it? I'll be direct. Your employment here is problematic. You lied on your application about your medical history. That's grounds for termination. More importantly, your connection to Elena raises serious questions about your motives." He'd leaned forward, his voice dropping to a threatening purr. "Did you research the family before applying? Target them specifically? Because from where I'm sitting, this looks like a woman with cancer history exploiting a widower and his grieving children for financial gain." Emma had felt fury rise in her throat. "I didn't know about Elena until I was already working here. I had no idea." But Gerald had cut her off. "That's not what the evidence suggests. And when Adrian's lawyers see this file I've compiled, they'll advise him that keeping you employed is a liability he can't afford, especially if he wants to maintain custody of his children." The custody threat had been a knife between Emma's ribs. What are you talking about? Gerald had smiled then, cold and satisfied. Adrian's been neglecting those boys for 2 years. Housekeepers and nannies raising them while he drowns in work. There are family members, Elena's relatives, who've been considering a custody challenge. They believe the children would be better off in a stable home environment. If it comes out that Adrian hired a woman with a fabricated background who has some mysterious connection to his dead wife, he'd spread his hands. Well, that doesn't look good for his judgment, does it? Unless, of course, you resign quietly. Sign a comprehensive NDA. Disappear. Then this stays private. Adrian keeps his children. Everyone wins. Emma had understood then. This wasn't about her medical history or hidden motives. This was about Gerald wanting Adrian vulnerable, distracted, desperate enough to sell the company Gerald had helped build but couldn't control, while Adrian remained focused and present. A father fighting for custody was a father who couldn't be manipulated into bad business decisions. "You're using those children as leverage," she'd said, disgust thick in her voice. Gerald had shrugged. "I'm protecting my investment. Adrian's been useless as a partner since Elena died. This arrangement, where he's actually trying to parent again, getting involved, it's bad for business. We have acquisition offers on the table that could make us both fortunes. But he won't take them while he's playing devoted father. You're the catalyst for this change. Remove you. He goes back to being the absent workaholic I can actually work with." Emma had left that meeting shaking with rage and fear. She'd gone straight to Adrian, who'd been in the library with the boys, actually reading to them. The scene had been so hopeful, 3 small bodies tucked against their father, his voice steady as he brought a storybook to life, that Emma had almost walked away rather than destroyed. But the truth couldn't wait. After the boys had gone to play, she'd told Adrian everything. Watched his expression shift from confusion to fury to something that looked like determination. "Gerald's been pushing me to sell for months," he'd said quietly. "I didn't realize how far he'd go." He'd looked at Emma with something like anguish. "I'm sorry you've been dragged into this. But I need you to know. I don't care about your medical history. I care that you're good to my sons. That you helped them when 17 other people couldn't. That you—" He'd stopped, emotion thick in his voice. "That you're keeping Elena's promise. Helping me be better. Be present." But being present, they were about to learn, meant having to fight for what mattered. Gerald's threats escalated over the next 48 hours. Anonymous calls to Child Protective Services claiming neglect. Emails to family court suggesting Adrian was unfit. Leaked stories to business press about Donovan's erratic behavior and questionable household staff decisions. The pressure was designed to force Adrian's hand, fire Emma, retreat back into work, become the controllable partner Gerald needed him to be. But something had changed in Adrian. The man who'd run from his grief for 2 years had found something worth standing his ground for. His children, and the woman who was helping him learn to be their father again. The counterattack had been methodical. Adrian hired forensic accountants to review Gerald's access to company finances. What they found was extensive embezzlement. Gerald had been siphoning funds for years, counting on Adrian's grief-stricken distraction to keep his theft hidden. The acquisition offers Gerald had been pushing weren't about making them both fortunes. They were about Gerald cashing out before his crimes were discovered. Adrian also discovered that the custody threats were empty. Elena's family had never considered challenging Adrian's fitness as a father. Gerald had fabricated that pressure entirely. And the anonymous email about Emma's background traced back to a private investigation firm Gerald had hired, using company funds he'd stolen to target someone who threatened his control. The confrontation happened in Adrian's office, with lawyers present and Emma watching from the doorway. Gerald had arrived thinking he was walking into a meeting about Emma's termination. Instead, he'd found himself facing evidence of his embezzlement, documentation of his harassment campaign, and a lawsuit that would end his career and likely put him in prison. Emma had watched the color drain from his face as Adrian laid it all out, his voice cold and steady. "You used my grief against me. You exploited my children's suffering for profit. And you tried to destroy a woman whose only crime was helping my family heal." Adrian had stood then, physically blocking Gerald's path to the door. "You're fired. Your access to company accounts is frozen. And if you ever come near my family again, I'll make sure the criminal charges are just the beginning. Gerald had tried to bluster, to threaten, to negotiate, but the evidence was overwhelming, and he'd known it. He'd left the estate that day under escort, his empire of manipulation crumbling. And in the silence that followed, Emma had felt something shift. The house didn't feel like a fortress anymore. It felt like it was breathing again, coming back to life after years of held breath. Adrian had turned to her after the lawyers left, his face showing exhaustion, but also something lighter. Relief, maybe. Or hope. "Thank you," he'd said simply. "For not leaving. For staying even when it got ugly. He'd gestured helplessly. For caring enough to fight for them." The evidence of the fight had rippled through the household in unexpected ways. Patricia had revealed that she'd been documenting Gerald's visits for months, suspicious of his interest in household matters that had nothing to do with business. The boy's tutor had quietly admitted she'd been pressured by someone. She now knew it was Gerald, to report any concerning behavior from Emma. Even the previous housekeeper's rapid departures made more sense in retrospect. Gerald had been systematically destabilizing the household, ensuring Adrian remained isolated and vulnerable. Emma's arrival had disrupted that pattern simply by doing what Elena had once done, showing up consistently, refusing to abandon the family when things got hard, treating the boys like they mattered more than money or power or business deals. The boys had sensed the shift too. Without the undercurrent of tension that had permeated the house, they'd relaxed in ways Emma hadn't seen before. Aiden had started asking his father questions again. Real questions, not tests, just genuine curiosity about the world. Benjamin had begun sleeping through the night, without nightmares. Christopher had stopped hoarding food in his room, the anxiety that had driven that behavior finally easing. And for the first time since Emma had arrived, all three boys had asked if she was planning to stay. Not just for this week or this month, but stay. Like permanently. Like family. Emma had been folding laundry when they'd cornered her. Three identical faces looking up with that blend of hope and fear she recognized from her own reflection during treatment. "Are you going to leave like the others?" Aiden had asked, his voice small. Emma had set down the shirt she'd been holding and knelt to their eye level. "I'm not planning to," she'd said honestly. "But things change sometimes in ways we don't expect. What I can promise is that I won't leave just because things are hard. I won't disappear without saying goodbye. And I'll do everything I can to stay as long as you want me here." Christopher had studied her face carefully. "You're different than the others. You feel like—" He glanced at his brothers. "Like she did. Mama. Not the same, but safe the same way." That conversation had been playing in Emma's mind the night Adrian knocked on her door. It had been late, past midnight, and Lily was asleep in the next room. Emma had opened the door in her pajamas, alarmed, thinking something was wrong with one of the boys. But Adrian had just stood there, still in jeans and a worn t-shirt, looking younger and more uncertain than she'd ever seen him. "I couldn't sleep," he'd said. "I keep thinking about everything that's happened. The impossibility of you being here. The timing. How Elena would have." He'd run a hand through his hair. "Can we talk?" They'd gone to the garden, sitting on a bench under stars that were clearer than anything Emma remembered from Queens, and Adrian had finally said what he'd been holding back. "I need to know if you're staying because of her. Because of some debt you feel you owe Elena. Because if that's why, I understand, but it's not enough. Not for what I'm about to ask you." Emma had turned to face him fully. "What are you about to ask me?" Adrian had met her eyes, and the vulnerability there had stolen her breath. To be part of this family. Not as staff. Not as the housekeeper paying back a debt. But as someone who chooses to be here. Who wants to be here. Because Emma and my boys love you. And I. He'd stopped, struggling with words that clearly didn't come easily. "I haven't let myself feel anything since Elena died. I shut it all down because feeling meant drowning. But you've made me feel again. Not the grief. Or not just the grief. But hope. Possibility. The belief that maybe we're not permanently broken. And I know it's fast. I know it's complicated. But I can't keep pretending this is just a professional arrangement. Not when I look at you and see someone I want in my life. In my sons' lives. Permanently. Emma had felt tears streaming down her face before she realized she was crying. "I'm not Elena," she'd whispered. "I can't replace her. I wouldn't even try." Adrian had taken her hands gently. "I'm not asking you to replace her. Elena will always be their mother, always be the woman I married and loved. But she's gone. And you're here. And you're your own person with your own strength and your own way of loving these boys. They need that. I need that." He'd paused, his voice dropping. And maybe this is what Elena meant. Not replacing her, but continuing what she started. The kindness she showed you coming full circle to help her children, to help me, to build something new from the pieces of what we lost. They'd sat in that garden until dawn, talking about possibilities and fears, and what it would mean to try to build a family from such fractured parts. Emma had told him about Lily, about her ex-husband's abandonment, about her own fears of not being enough. Adrian had shared his guilt about Elena's death, his terror of failing his sons again, his certainty that he didn't deserve another chance at happiness. And somewhere in those hours of brutal honesty, they'd found something neither had expected to find again. Not love exactly. That would take time, would need to be built carefully between two people who'd both been broken. But the possibility of love, the foundation of trust and respect and shared commitment to protecting the small, precious humans depending on them. The boys had found them in the garden as sun broke over the horizon, Lily trailing behind them in her pajamas. "Are you two finally done being weird and grown-up?" Benjamin had asked with 6-year-old directness. Aiden had rolled his eyes. "They're probably talking about whether Emma's gonna stay forever. Obviously she is. Right." And Christopher had just climbed into Emma's lap, resting his head against her shoulder with the absolute trust of a child who decided someone was safe. Adrian had looked at Emma over his sons' heads, a question in his eyes. And Emma, thinking of the stranger who'd sat with her in that clinic 7 years ago, who told her she was strong enough to survive, had nodded. "Yeah," she'd said softly. "I'm staying." The next 3 months had been about building something real from those fragile promises. Adrian had restructured his work schedule, delegating responsibilities he'd been clutching too tightly, making sure he was present for breakfasts and dinners and bedtime rituals. The boys had tested the new arrangement relentlessly, pushing boundaries to see if this version of their father would stay or disappear like everything else good in their lives. But Adrian had stayed, had sat through tantrums and homework battles and nightmares, learning to be the father Elena had believed he could be. Emma had helped navigate those rough patches, but she'd also stepped back when the boys needed their father specifically, understanding that her role was to support, not replace, that particular bond. Lily had integrated into the family with the adaptability of children, treating the triplets like the brothers she'd never had, squabbling with them one moment and fiercely defending them the next. The estate had gradually transformed from a mausoleum of grief into something that felt like an actual home. Music played in the kitchen again. Laughter echoed through hallways. Photographs of Elena stayed on the walls, but now there were new pictures beside them. The 5 children covered in paint from an art project. Adrian and Emma making pancakes, while the kids supervised. Family movie nights in pajamas. Not erasure of the past, but integration. Making space for joy without forgetting sorrow. The legal resolution with Gerald had been satisfying in its thoroughness. He'd pled guilty to embezzlement and fraud, serving a reduced sentence in exchange for full restitution. Adrian had restructured the company, bringing in partners who valued integrity over manipulation. The custody concerns had been definitively proven false, and Elena's family had actually reached out to express relief that Adrian was finally healing, finally being the father their daughter had believed he could be. The investigation into Emma's background had exonerated her completely. Her employment application had been entirely truthful. Her medical history wasn't legally required disclosure, and her connection to Elena had been coincidental, not predatory. The universe's way of balancing scales, just like Elena had always believed. There had been a moment, though, when Emma had gone back to that memorial room alone. She'd stood in front of Elena's photograph, looking at the woman who'd given her the will to fight 7 years ago, and tried to find words for what she was feeling. Gratitude, certainly, but also something like permission. "I hope this is okay," she'd whispered to the photograph. I'm not trying to take your place. I know I can't. But I love them. Your boys, your husband. And I think maybe you knew this would happen. Maybe that's why you helped me. All those years ago. So I'd be strong enough to help them when they needed it. The room had been silent except for the tick of a clock. But Emma had felt something settle in her chest. Peace, maybe. Or just the certainty that she was where she was supposed to be. The proposal, when it came months later, had been perfect in its simplicity. No grand gesture or public display. Just Adrian, on an ordinary Tuesday evening after the kids were in bed, sitting beside Emma on the couch they'd claimed as theirs. I was thinking, he'd said, his fingers tangled with hers, that maybe we should make this official. Not for anyone else's benefit, but for ours. Because I want to wake up every morning for the rest of my life, knowing you're here. That we're building this together. That Lily and the boys are siblings not just in practice, but in name. He'd pulled a small box from his pocket, not a flashy diamond, but a delicate band with 4 small stones. Emeralds. One for each of the boys. Because if you marry me, you're not just marrying me. You're choosing them too. And I need you to know that's what I'm asking. All of us. All of this. Forever. Emma had said yes through tears, thinking about impossible coincidences and debts the universe found ways to repay. She'd said yes because she'd learned that families weren't just born. They were built, piece by careful piece, by people choosing to show up every day even when it was hard. She'd said yes because Elena had taught her that kindness created connections that outlasted death, that rippled forward in ways you couldn't predict. And she'd said yes because sometimes the greatest gift you could give someone was simply staying, being present, refusing to run when things got difficult. The exact thing Elena had done for her 7 years ago in a Queen's clinic, when a stranger had sat down beside her and changed the entire trajectory of her life. The wedding had been small, in the garden where Emma and Adrian had first talked through the night. The boys had stood with them, Lily too. All 5 children part of the ceremony that made them legally a family. Patricia had cried. Elena's family had attended, embracing Emma as someone who honored Elena's memory by loving her children well. And if Emma had felt Elena's presence that day, a brush of wind through the roses, warmth in the sunlight, she'd chosen to believe it was blessing rather than haunting. A woman who'd built her life on kindness approving of the family, her kindness had made possible. They'd kept the memorial room, but changed its purpose. Now it was a space where the children could go to remember their mother, to talk about her, to ask questions about the woman they'd barely known but would always carry with them. Emma had helped them create journals there, writing letters to Elena about their lives, their questions, their fears. Adrian had started going there too, not to hide in grief, but to remember the good parts, the love they'd shared, the dreams they'd built, the woman who'd believed so fiercely in kindness and second chances. And gradually, that room had transformed from a shrine to something more like a bridge, a way to honor the past while moving forward into the future. Now, a year later, Emma stood in that garden watching Lily and the triplets play, her hand resting on her slightly rounded belly where new life grew. Another child, another chance, another chapter in this impossible story. Adrian had his arm around her, and for a moment she let herself feel the full weight of gratitude for how broken things could be rebuilt into something beautiful. She'd come to this house desperate, broke, running out of options. She'd stayed because of children who needed someone to show up and keep showing up. And she'd found a family, messy, complicated, built from loss and hope in equal measure, that felt more real than anything she'd ever known. Mama. Christopher's voice called out. He used that word for Emma now, naturally, without prompting. The other boys had followed suit, adding Mama Emma to distinguish her from Mama Elena, both women holding space in their hearts in different ways. Emma had wept the first time she'd heard it, overwhelmed by the trust it represented. Mama, come help us build this fort. She'd started toward them, but Adrian had caught her hand. Wait, he'd said softly. Just look at them for a second. Really look. And she had. For children, soon to be 5, laughing and building and just being kids in ways they hadn't been able to when she'd first arrived. Healing wasn't linear, wasn't perfect, but it was happening. Day by day, moment by moment, choice by choice. Thank you, Adrian had said, his voice thick with emotion. For not giving up. For seeing past the disaster we were to what we could be. He'd paused. For being exactly who Elena hoped you'd become when she sat with you all those years ago. Strong enough to survive. Strong enough to help others survive too. Emma had kissed him then, soft and grateful, before heading toward the children's voices. Because that was what Elena had taught her, in that clinic 7 years ago. That kindness wasn't weakness. That showing up mattered. That sometimes the greatest strength was simply refusing to abandon people who needed you. Even when, especially when, they tried to push you away. Behind her, the house stood solid and warm, no longer a fortress, but a home. Windows glowed with light. Music drifted from somewhere inside. One of the boys' playlists, probably. The memorial room's door stood open, no longer locked, no longer secret. Just another part of their story. Another room in a house that held both sorrow and joy, memory and possibility. Emma had come here thinking she was just taking a job, desperate for survival. She'd stayed because 3 small boys with haunted eyes had needed someone to see their pain instead of trying to fix it. And she'd built a life because sometimes debts the universe owed found ways to repay themselves, creating families from the most unlikely combinations of broken pieces. So when people ask Emma how she became the only housekeeper to survive in the Donovan household, the only one who stayed when 17 others quit, she doesn't talk about skills or qualifications. She talks about a stranger who once showed her kindness when she was dying. She talks about 3 boys who taught her that love doesn't replace loss. It just makes space for both to exist. She talks about a man who learned to stop running from grief and start living through it. And she talks about how sometimes the universe gives you a chance to repay a debt you never knew you owed, to become for someone else what another person once was for you. Not a replacement, not a copy, just someone who shows up, someone who stays, someone who believes that broken things can be loved back into wholeness, one day at a time. And if you ever find yourself wondering whether kindness matters, whether showing up for strangers makes a difference, whether the small acts of compassion you offer might ripple forward in ways you'll never see, Emma would tell you that she's living proof, that the woman who sat beside her in a Queen's clinic never knew she was planting seeds that would bloom 7 years later in a Connecticut garden, that Elena Donovan never knew the girl she helped would one day help her children, that sometimes the greatest legacies we leave aren't measured in money or status or things we build, but in the people we're kind to when it costs us nothing but time, in the moments we choose presence over convenience, in the decision to stay when leaving would be easier. What would you do if you discovered that the stranger who once saved your life had left behind children who needed saving? Would you see it as coincidence or destiny? Would you run from the weight of that responsibility? Or would you embrace it as the universe's way of completing a circle? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story reminded you that kindness creates ripples we can't predict, maybe hit that subscribe button, because there are more stories about the unexpected ways our lives intersect, and how the debts we don't even know we owe sometimes find ways to be paid. Thanks for listening.